Breaking news in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The FBI and law enforcement were back at Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson today.
FBI described the suspect in Nancy Guthrie's abduction as a male, 5'9" to 5'10" of average build.
Right now, he's who we want. Somebody out there knows who this is.
Regarding the missing persons case of Nancy Guthrie, that search is entering week 3.
Deborah, 84-year-old white female, 5'4", 150, brown and blue, last and wearing unknown clothing.
We still have hope. And I wanted to say to whoever has her or knows where she is.
She is full of kindness and knowledge. Talk to her and you'll see.
Some disappearances happen in an instant. A wrong turn, a random encounter, a brief moment of bad luck. But the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie felt different from the very beginning. Not chaotic, not impulsive, planned, because whoever came for her appeared to know exactly who she was and exactly how vulnerable she had become. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old and living quietly in Tucson, Arizona. Her world had grown smaller over the years. Serious health problems limited her movement. She depended on medication, a walker, and the support of her family to navigate daily life. Even simple routines required preparation and caution. Still, she tried to maintain independence. She stayed connected to family, enjoyed small dinners together, and followed a steady routine that gave structure to her days. Friends and neighbors described her as warm, careful, and predictable.
And so wonderful. Just the air, the quality of life is laid back and gentle.
In the way many elderly people become, she liked familiarity. She liked order, and routines create patterns. Patterns that someone can watch. January 30th began like countless evenings before it. Nancy spent time with her daughter, Annie, and other family members at their home in Tucson. It was normal, comfortable. The kind of evening nobody expects to remember forever. They ate dinner together, talked casually, spent time as a family. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested danger was already moving closer. But later, investigators would begin to believe someone may have been watching long before that night ever began. What signs suggest Nancy may have been watched before her disappearance? Around 9 p.m., the family arranged for an Uber to drive Nancy home. That decision would later become one of the most important details in the entire investigation. Normally, a rideshare trip is meaningless. Just another short drive through city streets. But in this case, investigators realized the Uber may have captured the final documented moments of Nancy Guthrie's normal life. The driver likely saw nothing alarming. An elderly woman, a quiet passenger, a short nighttime ride home. But modern vehicles are more than transportation now. Many rideshare drivers use multiple recording systems for safety. Interior cameras monitor passengers. Dash cams record the road ahead. GPS systems track routes down to the second. Which means the most important witness that night may not have been a person at all. It may have been the vehicle itself. Because investigators later started asking questions that became increasingly disturbing. Was another car visible during the ride? Did headlights remain behind them too consistently? Did a vehicle appear near Nancy's neighborhood before she arrived home? Had someone already been waiting? Experts reviewing the case pointed out something chilling. Crimes involving elderly victims with limited mobility often depend heavily on transportation. Nancy could not move quickly. She could not flee on foot. Anyone planning to abduct her would almost certainly need a vehicle nearby. And if someone had been planning this crime carefully, they may have started surveillance long before January 30th. That theory became even more alarming after investigators reviewed older security footage from Nancy's home, nearly 3 weeks before the disappearance. On January 11th, Nancy's doorbell camera captured a suspicious figure outside her residence late at night. The person did not appear to be delivering anything. Why is the Uber ride considered a critical piece of evidence in the investigation? They were not a neighbor, not family, not someone with an obvious reason to be there. Instead, the individual appeared cautious and concealed, lingering long enough to raise immediate concern. To experienced investigators, the footage looked less like coincidence and more like reconnaissance, a test run, someone studying the property, checking camera angles, watching routines, learning vulnerabilities. And if the same person returned weeks later, then Nancy may have unknowingly been targeted for a long time. The Uber eventually arrived at her residence sometime between 9 and 9:30 p.m. Nancy exited the vehicle and went inside alone. At first glance, everything about the scene later suggested an ordinary evening. Her glasses remained inside the home. Her medications stayed untouched. Her walker remained nearby. Her phone sat charging. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave. Nothing suggested a voluntary disappearance. Instead, investigators would later describe the home as frozen in the middle of normal life. Like someone had interrupted her night without warning. And then came the detail that changed everything. At 1:27 a.m. in the morning, on January 31st, Nancy's doorbell camera activated again. This time, the footage was impossible to dismiss. A figure dressed entirely in dark clothing appeared near the front entrance.
Masked man was seen on chilling doorbell video. They're now trying to build a physical profile.
The person's face was concealed. A backpack hung from their shoulders. The individual moved with purpose, calm, controlled, not like someone lost or confused, more like someone arriving for a specific reason. The timestamp mattered enormously. At 1:27 a.m., the neighborhood would have been almost completely silent, most residents asleep, streets empty, very few passing vehicles, very few witnesses. If someone wanted to move unnoticed through a quiet retirement community, this was the perfect hour to do it. But the timeline became even stranger after investigators examined Nancy's medical monitoring systems. Her Apple Watch and pacemaker data reportedly continued transmitting information until approximately 2:29 a.m. That created a terrifying 62-minute window. For more than an hour after the masked figure appeared outside the home, something happened inside. Investigators still do not know exactly what. What do you think could have happened inside the house during the 62-minute window? Maybe the intruder forced entry. Maybe Nancy opened the door herself. Maybe the suspect pretended to be someone trustworthy. But evidence inside the home strongly suggested one thing. Nancy Guthrie did not willingly leave that house. Every item essential to her survival remained behind. Her medications, her glasses, her phone, her walker. Family members insisted there was absolutely no chance. She simply wandered away into the night. Physically, it made no sense. Yet, according to reports surrounding the investigation, early assumptions initially treated the situation as a missing elderly person case rather than an abduction. Those first hours mattered. Because time is everything in disappearances. Security footage gets erased. Witnesses forget details. Vehicles vanish into traffic. And every minute spent looking in the wrong direction allows the trail to grow colder. Once investigators fully accepted that Nancy had likely been abducted, attention shifted toward one central question. How do you remove an 84-year-old woman with severe mobility limitations from her home in the middle of the night without anyone seeing it? The answer almost certainly involved a vehicle, a car parked nearby, close enough for quick movement, close enough to avoid attracting attention. But that question created another mystery. Where was it? Because despite cameras, security systems, and multiple possible escape routes, no suspect vehicle was immediately identified publicly, and that raised a chilling possibility. Maybe the person responsible had planned this far more carefully than anyone first realized. By the morning of January 31st, panic had already started spreading through Nancy Guthrie's family. Something was terribly wrong. Nancy was gone, but nothing inside the home made sense. Her glasses still sat where she normally left them. Her medication remained untouched. Her phone was still charging. Most importantly, her walker had been left behind. That single detail changed the entire case. Nancy could not comfortably move long distances without assistance. Family members later insisted there was no realistic scenario where she voluntarily walked away from the house in the middle of the night. How do you think the suspect managed to avoid detection despite surveillance cameras in the area? Not without her phone, not without her medication, and certainly not without the walker she depended on every day. To the family, the conclusion felt immediate. This was not a missing person case.
She is full of kindness and knowledge. Talk to her and you'll see.
This was an abduction. But the first critical hours of any investigation are often filled with uncertainty, and according to reports surrounding the case, valuable time may have been spent considering other possibilities. Investigators initially explored whether Nancy could have become disoriented or wandered away. Meanwhile, the clock kept moving. And in cases involving surveillance footage and digital evidence, every lost hour matters. Security systems overwrite recordings. Witnesses forget details. Traffic cameras recycle storage. A suspect vehicle can disappear forever before anyone even knows what they are searching for. As investigators slowly shifted toward the likelihood of kidnapping, attention turned back to the most important period of the night, the 62 minutes between the doorbell camera activation at 1:27 a.m. and the final signal from Nancy's Apple Watch around 2:29 a.m. Something happened inside that house during that hour. Something violent enough to end with an elderly woman disappearing without a trace. Investigators and analysts began reconstructing possible scenarios. Maybe the intruder convinced Nancy to open the door peacefully at first. Maybe they claimed to be security personnel, medical staff, or someone needing help. Or maybe entry had already been planned earlier in the evening. Some experts later suggested the perpetrator may have studied the property long enough to identify weak points around the home. An unlocked access point, a blind spot, a predictable routine. Whatever happened, the suspect appeared prepared. The backpack visible in the doorbell footage immediately caught attention. Investigators believed it could have contained tools, restraints, gloves, or items intended to control the scene quickly and quietly. Because this crime did not look spontaneous, it looked organized. And organized offenders are often the most dangerous, especially when they spend time studying victims beforehand. Investigators also became increasingly focused on what may have happened outside the home during those early morning hours. Because removing Nancy from the property would not have been simple. She could not move quickly. She likely needed assistance or physical carrying. That meant transportation had to be extremely close. The suspect could not risk moving her far through open streets where neighbors might notice movement or noise. So somewhere nearby, investigators believed a vehicle had probably been waiting in the darkness, and that vehicle became one of the biggest mysteries in the entire case. Nancy lived in a retirement community where unfamiliar cars could attract attention, especially late at night. Yet no obvious suspect vehicle was immediately identified publicly. How was that possible? Experts reviewing the case offered several theories. Maybe the perpetrator knew the neighborhood exceptionally well. Maybe they understood exactly where surveillance cameras were positioned. Maybe they intentionally parked outside the most visible areas. Or maybe investigators simply had not found the right footage yet. Because modern investigations generate overwhelming amounts of digital evidence, hours of traffic recordings, business surveillance systems, doorbell cameras, intersection monitors, private security footage, One investigator compared it to searching for a single grain of sand inside an entire desert. But Nancy's family refused to stop pushing. Her daughter Annie became deeply involved in trying to identify possible escape routes from the neighborhood. Using her own familiarity with the area, she created a detailed route map showing roads a kidnapper would most likely use to leave quickly while avoiding attention. The map highlighted schools, intersections, businesses, and nearby roads where surveillance cameras might have captured suspicious vehicles to some investigators. It may have looked like speculation born from fear and desperation, but others saw something different: local knowledge, because nobody understands neighborhood patterns better than the people who actually live there. Number 4, Tender C. One route on Annie's map passed an elementary school covered with security cameras. Like many modern schools, the property monitored entrances, parking lots, surrounding streets, and nearby sidewalks 24 hours a day. Another nearby business reportedly had exterior surveillance aimed directly toward the roadway at 2 or 3 inches in the morning. Traffic in those areas would have been minimal, meaning any passing vehicle should have stood out clearly, which raised a frustrating question. If cameras covered so much of the area, why hadn't investigators publicly identified the suspect vehicle? That mystery led to growing criticism surrounding the investigation. Some experts argued the perpetrator may have deliberately avoided main roads and major intersections entirely. Tucson contains isolated stretches of desert terrain, side roads, and lesser-used routes that someone familiar with the city could potentially use to avoid detection. Others believe the answer might already exist somewhere in the footage investigators were still reviewing. A car appearing repeatedly across different cameras, a vehicle slowing near Nancy's neighborhood, a driver circling the area before the abduction. One overlooked detail could eventually become the breakthrough. Then another strange lead surfaced. Weeks after Nancy disappeared, footage from a separate ring camera reportedly captured a suspicious vehicle traveling along a remote back road not far from her neighborhood during unusual hours. Initially, the sighting did not appear significant, just another vehicle at night. But later analysis changed the perspective entirely. When the location of that road was compared against Annie's route theories, the connection suddenly became difficult to ignore. The road avoided many major intersections. It bypassed some obvious surveillance locations, and it moved southward, away from the neighborhood, through quieter terrain. Exactly the type of route a careful offender might choose. Suddenly, the possibility became terrifyingly real. Maybe the suspect had planned every movement in advance, not just the abduction, the escape too. Because the deeper investigators looked into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the clearer one fact became. This was not beginning to look like a random crime. It was beginning to look like someone who prepared for it. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie became more disturbing with every new detail investigators uncovered. Because despite the lack of arrests, despite the missing vehicle, and despite the unanswered questions, evidence suggested something violent happened at Nancy's home that night. One of the most debated details involved blood found near the front porch area. According to investigators and forensic experts who later discussed the case publicly, the blood patterns carried characteristics that immediately stood out. The stains were not simple drips. They reportedly contained larger droplets surrounded by tiny satellite spots, a pattern forensic specialists often associate with blood expelled from the nose or mouth during respiratory distress. That distinction mattered enormously because it suggested the blood did not come from a staged scene or transferred evidence. It likely came directly from Nancy herself while she was alive and breathing. Experts examining the publicly available images argued the pattern matched what investigators call expirated blood mixed with air from the respiratory system. In simple terms, Nancy may have suffered some kind of medical or physical trauma near the front entrance of her own home. That possibility changed the emotional weight of the case completely. Suddenly, investigators were no longer looking only at a disappearance. They were looking at signs of an attack. What does the physical evidence suggest about what may have happened during the final moments of the incident? Some analysts even focused on plant material visible near portions of the blood evidence. At first, online speculation suggested the scene may have been staged after the fact. But investigators later pointed toward the doorbell footage itself. The masked individual appeared to place or move plant material near the camera area, possibly trying to block visibility. During movement near the porch, leaves and flowers may simply have fallen onto the blood afterward. If true, the sequence becomes chillingly simple. Nancy is confronted. A struggle or medical emergency occurs. Blood reaches the porch. The suspect attempts to interfere with the camera. Then Nancy disappears. And after 2:29 a.m., the digital trail ends completely. No confirmed sightings, no outgoing calls, no financial activity, nothing. For Nancy's family, the silence became unbearable. Every passing day without answers deepened the fear that investigators were no longer searching for a living victim, but for evidence of where she had been taken. Meanwhile, public criticism surrounding the investigation continued growing. Questions emerged about how the crime scene had been handled during the early hours of the case. Analysts and former investigators publicly debated whether mistakes made early on could later create problems if a suspect were eventually charged. Some worried important evidence had not been secured quickly enough. Others criticized conflicting public statements surrounding the investigation. And as leadership controversies surrounding local law enforcement intensified, experts began warning about a larger danger not only failing to solve the case, but damaging it permanently. Because even when investigators eventually identify a suspect, the case still has to survive court. Defense attorneys examine every mistake, every contradiction, every delayed response, every possible weakness. If evidence collection appears sloppy or incomplete, juries may begin doubting conclusions, even when the suspect is truly guilty. Several investigators later remarked that the Guthrie case could eventually become a teaching example for future law enforcement officers, not because of the crime itself, but because of how critical the first hours of an investigation truly are. Still, despite the criticism and uncertainty, many experts insisted the case was far from hopeless. Modern investigations operate differently than they did decades ago. Today, technology records nearly everything. Cars contain tracking systems. Phones create location histories. Businesses store surveillance footage. Traffic cameras monitor intersections. Doorbell cameras watch neighborhoods 24 hours a day. Even when offenders believe they moved unseen, they often leave digital footprints behind without realizing it. And somewhere inside that massive amount of information, investigators believe the answer may already exist. Maybe it is a vehicle appearing briefly in the background of footage no one initially considered important. Maybe it is a partial license plate captured on a distant camera. Maybe it is a cell phone signal near Nancy's home during the critical timeline. Maybe it is a person whose behavior changed suddenly after January 30th. One strange comment, one suspicious trip, one overlooked detail. Sometimes that is all it takes for a cold case to suddenly explode open. Investigators also continued examining the possibility that the suspect intentionally used alternative roads leading away from Tucson. Analysts reviewing geography around the city pointed out that a knowledgeable local could avoid major surveillance routes by using quieter roads and desert paths. That theory gained more attention after reports surfaced about the suspicious vehicle captured on the remote back road outside the neighborhood. The footage itself reportedly did not provide enough information for immediate identification, but the timing, location, and direction of travel raised serious questions, especially because the road aligned with possible southern escape routes leading away from the city, away from cameras, away from witnesses, and potentially toward the border. Whether that vehicle was connected to Nancy's disappearance remains publicly unknown, but the possibility reinforced one terrifying conclusion. Whoever committed this crime may have spent weeks preparing it, watching, learning, planning, waiting for the perfect moment. And when that moment arrived shortly after 1:27 a.m. on January 31st, they moved with precision. Nancy Guthrie vanished during a single hour in the middle of the night. An elderly woman with serious medical needs disappeared from her own home, despite cameras, security systems, and modern technology surrounding nearly every street. Yet somehow, the person responsible escaped, at least for now. But investigators continue reviewing evidence, analyzing data, and following leads, even months later. Many experts believe the breakthrough could come from technology itself, as newer tools allow older evidence to be re-examined in ways that were impossible before. Because digital evidence does not forget, footage can be enhanced, data can be recovered, patterns can be reconstructed. And one day, a single overlooked detail may finally expose the person who believed they committed the perfect crime. Until then, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance remains one of the most haunting, unanswered cases in Tucson. A quiet evening, a masked figure at the door, one missing hour, and a family still waiting for the truth.